Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm pleased and honored to be here today. Thanks again for having me here, and special thanks to my friend and colleague. Okay, my Russian is coming back. I don't know why. Alexander Liebman, and it's a really happy moment, and for such a generous introduction as well. I feel like my ego is inflating right now. Yes, I will talk a little bit about morphology of narratives, but I have to start with a disclaimer. I'm not a post-colonial theorist at all, and post-colonial. Thank you. I'm from much more old-fashioned type of sociology. We study collective representation. We study systems of beliefs that different groups of people, different large social groups possess, and those systems of beliefs, something that allow them to see the world, to map the world. They work as optic devices, but not only optic devices. What I will be focusing today on is that what kind of emotions those narratives produce, how they reveal themselves in political narratives, in everyday talks, and so on. So originally, post-colonial topic was absolutely not my cup of tea. Unfortunately, leaving Russia after 24th, actually I did it a little bit before, maybe we'll tell about it a little bit, before the full-scale invasion of Russian forces to Ukraine. And living in Israel during 7th of October, it's hard to miss this narrative of post-colonialism, and it takes a little bit effort to understand how it's organized, what is the architecture of this optical device. But I will start with anecdotes as usually. If you will visit the website of Russian General Consulate in Haifa, you will see, for example, on the very first page that among news and pictures, the most important topic is fighting neocolonialism. So if you will go to that web page, you will find a list of so-called white papers accusing collective West and its allies in all possible crimes against humanity. And if you will go deeper and read what people are translating as a part of official narrative nowadays, you will see that during the last year and a half, that post-colonial narrative is becoming a very important part of Putin's propaganda. Actually, just a few months ago, Sheikh Rabil Gainuddin explained in Kazan during that very important event called Forum Islamic World, that only because of the targeted policies of Western countries, be it France in the 19th century, Great Britain in the 20th century, USA and Israel today, actually is a main source of all maldeeds. And the Russian Federation has never pursued a colonial policy in the Middle East. So that's how it looks now, but if you will compare it to the official narrative that was translated by Russian officials just a few years ago, you didn't find anything close like that. It was completely different. And trying to explain that colonial turn in official Russian narratives, scholars usually produce two explanations. First is opportunism, because Russia wants to present itself as a leader of global South, which is a bit ironic, at least in geographical terms, because words South and Russia are not actually very well go together. But opportunism is one of the key explanations, that because Putin wants to present himself as a fighter with the colonial domination of imperialist countries, that's why it happened, but why it happened so late, why it happened only a year ago. And another explanation is inertia, just because there's a very strong inertia of Soviet anti-Zionist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist propaganda, so why not to use it again? The problem with those two explanations is that you can explain everything with those two things. They're universal, absolutely. For example, opportunism you can find in Japan propaganda of Second World War, because Japan presented itself as anti-colonial power. And it was a major trope of Japanese propaganda that we are fighting British and American colonialism here to establish a new sphere of co-prosperity. So that's opportunistic framing, as we call it. And of course, I'm terribly sorry for that image, but that's a cartoon from Soviet journal, Soviet magazine called Crocodile from 1982, how it was presented the Lebanon war of Israel. That's why Putin is now comparing the blockade of Gaza in Israel-Hamas war with the siege of Leningrad. That image of siege and that comparison between Nazi Germany and Israel has deep roots in anti-Zionist Soviet propaganda. And that was almost everywhere in 1970s and 1980s. I think it's till Perestroika. The most famous book, you definitely remember it, Fascism Under the Blue Star. That's exactly where that Putin's narrative came from. But those two explanations are not quite satisfactory because everything can be explained with opportunism. Now it's his move to present himself as a leader of Global South. That's why we will use this. Or no, this inertia because it comes from Soviet time and even pre-Soviet time. However, it doesn't explain what actually brought the power of narrative, the emotional power of this anti-colonial narrative as a part of Russian official propaganda. So I will try to take a bit different angle here. I will try to take the angle of collective representation theory from the point of view of sociology of knowledge and sociology of culture, or cultural sociology, if a little bit more correct. So actually we can assume, and that's basic conceptual axioms of that approach, that every time when we face a narrative, we should see how actually identity is constructed in that narrative, what kind of major distinction that in that narrative we can find. And Jeffrey Alexander, in his brilliant book, The Meanings of Social Life, is trying to explain what's the difference between narrative and storytelling. If I tell you a story, something like, if you go to a web page of Haifa General Consulate, it's just one part of our communication. It does not necessarily to be charged by my worldview, by Weltanschauung, by something that I really strongly believe in. So stories are multiple, stories are different. We tell stories to each other in social networks all the time. But sometimes those stories can shape a basic story, something that presents our values, our identities, our fears and hopes. In order to do so, it's supposed to be based, first of all, on frames. And frame analysis theory, and I'm basing on Irving Goffman's frame analysis theory from his 1974 book, Frame Analysis of Everyday Life. Frames are those devices, rhetoric devices, that we are using to label events, objects, and subjects, actors. So a treason never prospers, but the reason, because otherwise no one calls it treason. So you need to have that framing, for example, colonial power or corrupted dictatorship. You need to have that semantics that as bricks used to build a narrative. But the third level, which is much deeper and more important to us, is a level of beliefs, or as Durkheim called it, symbolic classifications. Those symbolic classifications based on two major oppositions. Every social group has, first of all, distinction between what is profane and what is sacred. Profane is something we can discuss. We can discuss politics to some extent. We can discuss things about economics, I believe, which is probably the most profane thing. And discuss means rationally discuss. Not to offend anyone's feeling. Probably I wouldn't offend Alexander's feelings if I say, you know, the GDP of Russia during the last 2 years was not so. So that's profane. It's something that is eligible for rational discussion. Sacred, and here comes another distinction. Sacred as a pure evil or sacred as a pure good is something we don't discuss. Something we all agree. That's how communities actually know each other. They know that we belong to the same circle. We do not discuss the same thing because we presume that we share the same axioms. We share the same optics. We share the same basic distinctions. So it's not about values, as Max Weber would probably call it. It's about beliefs. It's about collective representations that work as distinctors. So if we will take a look how the narrative of Russian politics was shaped during the period of 2014 and 2022. That's exactly the period where we started our Eurobarometer in Russia, trying to map those systems of beliefs for different groups of people. You can find 4 layers. We had a group of people that in 2014 was no more than a third of population. It was no more than 30% actually of population according to our data, Eurobarometer, who strongly believe that there is something like collective West as a global threat to Russia. They really strongly believe that European Union and of course the United States present some kind of evil intentions towards Russia, and that's the main geopolitical challenge for Russian Federation. This is the level of global evil. On the second stage, we have our strong national leader, Vladimir Putin, as a source of hope, and all people should praise him for being such a strong and unchangeable, I don't know why else, leader of the country. So leader as a source of hope and expectations for the future. On the third level, so this is a level of global good. On the third level, we have the fifth column, us, or as Putin calls us, national traitors, as imminent threat to the stability of Russian region. So something that is already there. If collective West is a transcendent evil of the global scale, fifth column, national traitors are already here. They're teaching our kids at universities. They're giving advices to people who believe them. They're pretending to be an experts. So they infiltrated our body of our country. And in order to help to our strong national leader, loyal and patriotic majority, marker of identity, fourth level, should do something with them. That's a very stable system of beliefs that show you what is on the global side and what is on the local side, where localized the source of threat, 2 of them, and sources of hope, also 2 of them. Narrative 2, that was not such a minority narrative in 2014, but during next 8 years it was on decline. It was a narrative according to which the whole world is a community of democratic nations as a source of global hope, because democracy is prevailing. Democratization is something that will happen imminently, and if Russia is not going to that direction, it's just it's temporary stop. We will be there. We will be part of the Europe. We will integrate in that community. But because of our corrupted dictator, the level of threat, we are not there yet. So he is the main obstacle to that process of modernization, democratization, and globalization. But thanks God, third level, there is a thinking minority, intelligentsia, people with education, who read books, who teach students, who have brains, I don't know. And they strongly believe, and that's marker of identity, because people who share that narrative, they all actually consider themselves to be part of that group. That's actually the source of hope here. While we are in Russia, while we are still here, we are part of that. So it's imminent good. It's some kind of local hope. But unfortunately, we are minority. There are masses intoxicated by propaganda, and that's why they are actually a major threat to us. So as you can see, the same 4 elements, but you can also see that they're absolutely symmetrical. People who shared that system of beliefs, they were called liberals, no matter how left or right they were, because in Russian political discourse, if you do not share the first narrative, you are already liberal. So, or traitor, which is absolutely synonymous there, at least at that period. So, but you also consider they are mirroring each other. That's a very symmetrical thing, because where you have evil collective West, in narrative one, you have community of democratic nations here, where you have our strong national leader, here you have corrupted dictator. There you have a fifth column, national traitors, here thinking minority. There you have masses of loyal and patriotic citizens, here you have masses intoxicated by propaganda. So those four levels during this period actually were more and more polarized. And every new event was supposed to be interpreted through that matrix. For example, COVID in 2020, it was a major challenge for both narratives. How can you frame it? What the hell is going on? And for 3 months, it was absolutely optic collapse. Nobody could frame it and put in some particular cognitive cell. For example, Russian Orthodox Church, one of the most conservative, was arguing for more liberalization of lockdown. So more personal freedom, because people need to go to church for Easter service. And on the other side, most liberal Russian media, like very oppositional, were arguing for more severe measures of lockdown. It was like they just swapped rhetoric for 3 months. But after 3 months, everything is fine. The narrative is always restoring itself. That's why for narrative number one, for narrative number two, COVID became a meta threat. It was existential global threat. That source of fear, because that global threat affects community of democratic nations, which means that international cooperation is falling down, which means that our corrupted dictator will use that situation of international decline of cooperation, and so on. So as you see, it's supposed to be an alteration. It's supposed to be hope, fear, hope, fear. And even if it's mirrored, it's still supposed to be hope, fear, hope, fear. That's why how the first narrative would react to COVID. They need to put it some here. So it was framed in a Hobbes style, existential fear. Because what's happening now is that because of lockdown, social cohesion, solidarity among people is going down, because now people locked in their apartments and they start to fear each other. And as soon as they start to fear each other, it means that social capital, social trust among people is going down, which means that social institutions are starting to fail, which means that fifth column will use that situation to overthrow our strong national leader. So you see, COVID became a threat, but very different threat for two political languages, very different threat for two political systems of beliefs. For one, it's somewhere where global warming is. For another, it's where Thomas Hobbes is, the fear of existential threat from each other. So that's how it worked for 8 years. The polarization, and every new political event should be interpreted either in one narrative or another one. So, but what happened next? How did it happen after the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation? Look again for a second to the first narrative. It's absolutely not anti-colonial. It's a conservative, it's a very traditional, it's very nationalistic, but it's definitely not post-colonial. It's not definitely about Russia being a leader of global South fighting colonialism all over the world, right? But after 24th of February, another picture of the world, another Weltanschauung stood in. So in that picture of the world, we will find this system of belief in a work of Jean-Paul Sartre, in his brilliant speech that he gave on Russell Tribunal in 1967, when they decided to blame American military for Vietnam War and so on. So Sartre is doing a good job of framing. He's saying, actually, the world consists of 4 stages. First is American imperialism, and that is a global threat. But thanks God, there are people's democracies as a global hope, from Soviet Union to China to Vietnam and so on. Those countries that are trying to stop the world from going to hell of imperialism. something who is probably will prevail. And in Greek Orthodox theology, this figure of speech is called katechon. Katechon is someone who is helping to stop, is some kind of break. It's like the idea, the image behind it, that Antichrist is already here among us, but still there is someone who will stop the world from his domination. And this one is already among us. So for Jean-Paul Sartre, the katechon, people's democracy, Soviet bloc, because the world is already dominated by American imperialism. So it's supposed to be some few islands in opposition to it. On the third level, we have colonial regimes and as a local threats. For Sartre, it's a very important distinction between imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism is an octopus in Washington, but each particular part of the octopus, each tentacle is a colonial regime. So that is helping to octopus to take over all resources from the planet. So imperialism is a global threat, colonialism is a local threat. And of course, they have subordinative relationships, of course, as always between global evil and local evil. But there is a last level, people's liberation movements, as a local hope, as a source of future change. So for people who believe in this type of, who share that system of belief, from Che Guevara to Hamas, it's a people's liberation movement, because they fight colonialists who are managed by imperialists. On a global level, it's supposed to be some kind of people's democracy movement. On a local level, it's supposed to be people's liberation movement. So we still see the same four elements, but there is a problem with people's democracies after 1991, right? Soviet Union is not there anymore. Not so many countries can pretend to take that position of a second level. And at the end, Vladimir Putin decided that it's a great idea to merge those two narratives. First, narrative one about global West, that now we will call American imperialism, right? And this one, the globalize the Putin's fight with anti-colonialism. It's just a globalization of the same system of beliefs. So that's how that shift from traditionalistic, conservative, nationalistic rhetoric to post-colonial rhetoric happened. Just to give you a few examples, those two cartoons from Soviet propaganda, it actually explains the same system of beliefs, but gives it much more picturesque view. Here you can see Pinochet and Israeli Prime Minister. They're colonialists supported by evil imperial capital, neoliberal probably. So this is by Boris Yefimov and 1972. Here you see much more traditional anti-Semitic image of Israeli aggressor. Can you guess what? And of course, Ukrainian nationalists. So they are two colonial supporters of one imperial evil, two local evils and one global evil. Can you guess what year is that? When that shift from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism happened in Russian Soviet political imagery? It's 1982. The perestroika is closer, freedom of speech is much more open, so old stereotypes are coming back. It's not the only one. That's my favorite. You probably heard about the problem with Harvard Crimson when they posted that picture on their website. And that was kind of not just anti-Zionist, it's clearly anti-Semitic. And they had to apologize and so on and so on. But you can see here the same four actors on the same page. You can find a global evil, you can find a local evil, you can find a global good and a local good. So what's interesting that if you just replace Magen David with the American flag, it's legitimate. All you need is to take the Magen David from the hand and mark it here. So evil imperialism that is ruling the world using local colonial power that is strangling poor, suffering, and oppressed people, and only people liberation movement can free them. The same 4 elements. Actually, it's a bit offensive because we used to rule the world, and now we are just colonial puppets of imperialism. That's anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's when you are not taking anti-Semitism seriously. Like, we are not part of conspiracy. Americans now are taking that place, and that's for Israelis. It's a bit it's diminishing the dignity of people who rule the world. You know, it's like we became local evil. We used to be global evil. It's what the deglobalization of evil. I don't know. So that's the problem of misframing. If you want to do it from anti-Semitic to anti-Zionist, all you need to do is replacing Magen David with American flag and put Magen David here, so as a local problem. So I don't want to quote that, but you will find a lot of narrative like that, not only in Putin's propaganda, but in the Grayzone, if you know that. Oh, you know that. You know it. Aaron Matta and Max Blumenthal using the same system of beliefs and give it a lot of emotional spin in their narratives. It's like global imperialism, but now there are 2 different, you see here it's Pinochet and Israeli Prime Minister, and here is Ukrainian nationalist and Israeli Prime Minister. So now for Grayzone authors, 2 major colonialists are Netanyahu and Zelensky, because they are proxy of American imperialism, and they start to do this kind of symmetrization to genocidal regimes, as they say, and they both are getting support from the states, and they both run the genocidal war. It's more or less clear what is the people liberation movements for Blumenthal and Mata in case of the Middle East. You can guess what is the people liberation movement in case of Ukraine for them. Donbass, separatists of LDNR, so-called LDNR. I don't know how to say it correctly. So that is much deeper resemblance between post-colonial rhetoric and Putin's original narrative from which it started. It's not somehow opportunistic shift. It's not because of Soviet inertia, but because those 4 elements were actually deeply enrooted into that system of beliefs before 2022. So how to deal with this? And people who both hate Putin and still want to use colonial narratives, colonial theory, they need to produce some kind of reframing move or framing move. So they try to say that Putin actually is a colonial puppet of American imperialism. That's probably not the smartest move to do. It's a very weird framing, but still that attempt was made by Grigory Yudin. Putin didn't suddenly emerge from the Siberian forests. I love this. It's the same as it didn't happen in vacuum. So the same trope, rhetoric. It didn't happen in vacuum. He didn't suddenly emerge from the Siberian forest. International technology giants are ready to make any concessions for the sake of earning money on the Russian markets. From Google, which is ready to remain silent about physical threats to its top management from Russian special services, to Nokia, which helped Putin build a total surveillance system for his opponents. So we now know whom to blame, right? It's not Russian colonial aggression anymore. It's Google and Nokia. That's the real reason. So they actually subordinate the Putin's regime as a colonial power to neoliberalism and to imperialism as a global evil, trying to fit what happened to that particular cognitive cell. It didn't work well, actually. But some people still trying to do it. However, as you see, those who blame Putin for colonial aggression and imperialistic war, try not to mention anything outside of the region, because otherwise you will have to say Putin is colonialist. It means that actually there is some kind of connection with the global evil. He's not global himself. It's the actually one particular part of the world. That was one framing move. But what happened to the narrative too after 2020? What happened to those who are trying to, who believed in globalization, who believed in democratization, who actually called themselves liberals? What's happened to that narrative? First step, when they replaced corrupted dictator with a colonialist and imperialist, but it didn't work well because those two frames do not belong to that narrative. And that system of beliefs is quite consistent. So it wouldn't work well in terms of colonial theory, in terms of colonial discourse. So people who actually really looked at the world through those lenses, through those categories, are completely destroyed. That narrative didn't rebirth. It doesn't exist anymore in Russia. Maybe there are some circles where you can find people still using this kind of optics, but it's kind of hard to find in public discourse. The optimism about globalization, the belief in progress, that Russia under Putin is just a permanent stop on this way, is not anymore a common belief, even among those who share the same political identity. So I promised Alexander that I will have some lessons for Eastern Europe. The problem that it's hard to draw any lessons from the analysis of narratives, beliefs, frames, because it's actually analysis. It's not something you can draw a Weltanschauung upon. You can study Weltanschauung, but not to produce any. But what can I say? That is an apartment where I lived during last year in Moscow. When September 28th, two FSB officers unarmed at 6 o'clock in the morning came to arrest me, I left my apartment through the window, and that's why I'm here. So I can produce only one firm methodological advice. If you are trying to do your field work in Russia, make sure you have an emergency exit from your apartment. That's the only lesson for Eastern Europe I can draw from that narrative analysis. Thank you very much for your attention. I think that I would be happy to follow with the questions, right? It'll be better. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. All right. Go on.
I think I don't need a microphone.
Because you are the only one who is recorded. So
Okay,
Yeah.
so hierarchy even here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Anastasia, and I'm dealing in also my journalistic work a lot with decolonial movements within Russia. And those are the people, especially the indigenous peoples of Russia, who understand the real Russian imperialism and colonialism. But what I'm also observing is that they stick to the global left-wing anti-Zionist narrative. And I would like to ask you if, like, what would you think are the reasons for it? Because if people are actually working and elaborating the history of Russian colonialism and imperialism, why don't they understand that also the anti-Zionism that we saw, the global export of anti-Zionism, was also one of the products by the imperialist Soviet Union? So, yeah, what is
Pretty much. Yeah, Soviet Union was much better in producing narrative than Putin's Russia. It's humiliating, no fantasy at all. Soviet propaganda was much richer in terms of this worldview system of beliefs. And but that's interesting, because what you're saying about this anti-colonial circles of intellectuals in, for example, republics of Russian Federation. When we were interviewing them, because I was working a lot in national republics doing interviews there, it's interesting how they combine their hate to Putin's regime with their hate to Americans. It worked like this. There is a global American plot, conspiracy. They help Putin to oppress us here in Chuvastia, for example, or in Yakutia. And that's why there is no global good. there are two global evils, Americans and Putin, and they always can deal with each other, and we are the only one who are under that pressure. Because remember, in Jean-Paul Sartre ideas, there is some kind of global good, Soviet Union. There is still some kind of second level. And actually, Antonio Negri believed that Iran is going to be this global good. But that's the problem. When you use this kind of decolonization rhetoric in Russian context, it's becoming incredibly conservative. Because what is behind this? What kind of image is behind it? That world is mired in evil and possessed by devil, by evil corporations, by evil regimes, and everybody cares only about its economic benefit. Nobody cares about human lives. That's why for them, Putin and Biden, Putin and Trump are the same. They don't see it like, it's not pro-American, it's not pro-globalization, it's not pro-democracy. It's anti-Putin and anti-imperialistic. And pretty much it was also our fault, because we were teaching social theory, and social theory is always critical, and social critical theory gave a lot of false ideas, probably not false. It's a bad habit to call ideas false when you study them. But this image that this evil, you. And there's no hope, no source of hope somewhere there. And that's pretty much why shouldn't they believe it? Why they should see any hope from the West sitting there? They believe that sooner or later Putin will have an agreement with the European Union, with American administration, and they will be the only losers again. So that's a very pessimistic narrative. And it's like Jean-Paul Sartre, but without Catejon. Sorry, about anti-Zionism, it's pretty much the part of, it's becoming part of oppositional rhetoric in Russia now as well. But I don't know actually how strong it is, because my abilities to study how those narratives are evolving now in Russia are very limited, because I'm not there anymore. That's why you always need to take it cum grano salis. That's probably, we can make a lot of false conclusions as well because of that. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, I've got a question. What do you think can somehow change the power of this narrative? And specifically, I wonder what you think about the potential of the idea of human rights in combining these narratives, right? Because one cannot deny that Russian imperial forces harm civilians in Ukraine. One cannot deny that Israeli armed harm civilians in Palestine, and Hamas harm civilians, and so on and so forth. And I feel like there could be a common ground, sort of, based on the idea of human rights, which can defeat this narrative. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Actually, this idea of human dignity, which is very connected with the idea of human rights, has a very strong connection to that narrative. Narrative number 2. Because Community of Democratic Nations is based on the idea that human rights and human dignity as a universal concept, universal natural human right, should be recognized as a part of our agreements between those nations. It's a very old idea from French Revolution to Napoleon Wars, the idea that first of all you belong to humankind. As a part of humanity, you already possess some freedom, some natural rights, right for life, right for freedom, and in some theories for property as well, but doesn't matter. So that universalist understanding in that narrative actually was a major source of hope, that sooner or later, even in Russia, we will become part of that global community of nations, because we also respect human dignity. We also think that human rights is an important thing. Unfortunately, a lot of theorists who are strongly opposed Putin, but also strongly opposed the idea of universal human dignity and universal human rights. And for them, your individual human rights are always on the second place. Because first of all, there are rights of groups, collective rights. There are rights of oppressors, no rights, and rights of oppressed. For example, right to resist. That's why when you are putting those collective rights in front of individual rights. When you are saying that, first of all, you belong to a certain group, and that's why you are allowed to do this and that. And only then, maybe universal rights, which are not universal anymore. That's becoming a major problem. Because now we don't have that common denominator. Because before it was like, okay, we are left rhetoric, we are right rhetoric, but we all share the same basic values. First of all, value of human rights, democracy, value of dignity as something irreducible, something that cannot be taken away. And everybody, every single individual is first of all human being, and then he belongs to a certain group, blah, blah, blah. When you are changing that equation, and you are saying that you are first representative of a certain social group, and then maybe you have rights and maybe not, or as legal positivists say, if you live in totalitarian state, you have no rights because there is no such thing as universal natural rights. They are all given to you by the state. If it's not given, you don't have it. So that's the problem even among scholars who are doing this. Because even I say something like what you just said about this universality of human dignity and the universal idea of human rights, among some of my sociological colleagues, they would say, what kind of universalism is that? Your universalism is just another mask for your imperialism. Because if you are trying to say something like, there is a universal value of human dignity, they say, no, 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 no. That's imperialistic rhetoric, because you are using the concept of universality to mask your privileged position. And that actually was a major obstacle to discussion between anti-Zionists and pro-Zionists, even in British academia, for example, where I know a little bit better, much better than German one. Because it was a British university in Moscow where I used to work for 13 years. So that's the problem. I'm afraid human rights is not anymore a central value to the discourse we all share. Sorry, I didn't want to sound so pessimistic today, actually. It was not supposed to be official distribution of depression, but it turned that way. I'm sorry about it. Any more questions?
Thank you. I enjoyed your lecture, interesting parallels. But I'm wondering, could you please elaborate a little bit more? Why do you think this narrative, second narrative, now disappeared? Because I quite see it everywhere anyway, and I would say even that the forward version of Ukraine even reinforced it.
Of course, yeah, but
especially in relations to this idea that Russians. Majority of Russians support the war.
Wait a second, it reinforced it within Russia? Yeah. Really? I want to see the empirics, because what we have, of course, Integrum database and everything like this, when you see decline of all keywords from that narrative, like immediately. But if you have, for example...
I mean, I have an impression.
Impression.
This is why I would like...
That's why we need check it, because first there is a problem now. Where can we find the narrative? We can find it in essays, in interviews, blah 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 blah, and then it was transferred into essays, for example. We don't see it there much, because that was a real progressive narrative. People really believed in progress, because what narrative brings to your system of beliefs, to your system of symbolic representation, it gives temporal dimension. Because it not just tells you where good and evil is, but tells you what's going to happen, where the world is going. And that was very progressive narrative, which is in Russia now hard to find, very hard to find. And the problem is that even in diaspora, because we have a lot of interviews with the people like you and me living abroad, even in all those communities, you don't see anymore much of progressivism. So it's interesting what will happen to Russian liberalism next decade. It was much easier to be liberal when you were blamed as a liberal, when that was a synonym to traitor. Okay, and now it's even unclear what does it mean to call yourself a liberal when you're a Russian liberal in exile. So I have very bad expectations about the future of this narrative, actually.
Maybe I still try to interrogate your own Eastern European studies.
You remember that I'm not really...
Yeah, but I Let me try to reconstruct what you're saying now, and I'm just curious in your opinion of that as social theorists. So if we look at Eastern European studies, at least the social science part of those which I know less about culture and history. I would say most social scientists who worked on Russia in the last decade, myself including, were kind of part of this narrative too. I mean, they didn't reproduce this narrative too about Russia. They saw their Russian interlocutors, partners, colleagues as part of this thinking minority, and themselves as allies of this thinking minority associated with the community of democratic values. Now we have the full-scale invasion, we have the war, and we have the Jean-Paul Sartre's narrative, we have the post-colonial narrative, which actually already in the past was massively present in other area studies, but not in studies of Russia, by the way, also not in studies in China. This is actually empirically interesting to see. This also translates the methodologies which we used. So people who worked on Russia and in China were much more positivist, rational choice, quantitative, because it kind of fit this idea of being part of community of democratic nations and global academia, which I also admired, while people who worked in Africa were much more, well, anti-colonial, so reproducing the Sartre's narrative, because their local interlocutors, the people who they felt emotionally for, were victims of global evil and local evil. What happens now in Eastern European studies, and the reason why we have this study class, is that the ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre's narrative are kind of squeezing in traditional way of how people think about Eastern Europe. And this, if I understand you correctly, creates the tension between the global evil and the local evil level. So we cannot take over any elements of post-colonial narrative without automatically saying that Putin is a puppet of American imperialism, which is a very strange thing to say. However, and this is the question part, there exists another way of thinking about collective rights of oppressed minorities in Russia, which is very old, and I mean, you see, for example, in Captive Nations Week in the United States, which explicitly sees Russia as at least part of this global evil, colonial evil, oppressing people, and sees United States as a liberator. That's pre-World War I and World War II.
Absolutely.
How Americans saw themselves. So I'm curious whether, first of all, you see a place for the classical post-colonial optic among those who study Russia. I mean, you know, people like Vyacheslav Morozov who tried to apply it.
Yeah.
And, but at the same
for some reasons.
And at the same time, what about the second narrative? I don't know. It's not post-colonial, right? But it's still focusing on the same story. It's just replacing the global evil and global hope. At the same time, keeping local evil, local hope the same.
I really like this idea, but I'm afraid to, that now we're working a little bit like spin doctors, but a bit more than analysts. So if I understood you correctly, it means that should we just switch those two places? It means that the whole world.
Who do we switch?
Yeah. I'm just.
Logically work. I'm not suggesting.
No. I'm just thinking. Let's check if it's gonna be sustainable. So in this narrative, we should say that America nowadays is not anymore a hegemonial subject. It's not anymore a global power. America nowadays is an island that is resisting to global evil, which means Russia. It is evil, or China, or Iran. So what you need here is to do what Sartre did, because he was not talking about bipolar world in 1967. He was saying, no, there is monopolar world, imperialistic one, with some islands of resistance. So what you suggest is to reflect this narrative, saying like, no, the whole world is really doomed. It's mired in Putinism. It's mired in global conspiracy of what? We got to think about the obscurancy. And America is a small warrior like David and Goliath, and who is resisting to that global evil. But global evil, like Putinism, has some kind of local evil. What would be then? I don't know. No, that's your that's yours. It's a German local thing. But I think that it's interesting. But in this case, you will have to do this kind of asymmetrical reweight, like adding much more weight to Putinism, saying that Putinism is a more global phenomena than American imperialism. It's not imperialism. Putin's imperialism is really global. Americans' democracy is just a small resistance. That's something that is trying to stop it. Catejon, something that's trying to, withstand.
Actually, people who are doing that, who work on democratic backsliding and stuff like this, are a bit trying to construct this narrative. But I don't want to take too much time.
Okay. Thank you.
Your presentation and for which is not only interesting but also provoking and engaging as well. And I have a feeling that your second narrative is already one today because I have a question about the second narrative as well. And could you please elaborate your ideas how you came to these 4 points? Because I have a feeling that you or your colleagues try to create 2 narratives, like negative and positive narrative, about those who are involved in particularly ongoing conflict and who are not involved in it. And coming back to the second narrative, I would say it looks like justification or even excuse how to explain our guilty or that we are not guilty. It's like an attempt to create a narrative about good Russian identity, I would say so.
Wait a second.
Yeah, to be more neutral. Yeah, it's like it looks like an attempt to create a good Russian identity. Could you please?
Yes, sure. I always enjoy the attraction of fight between good Russians and the best ones. And so that framing move, as we call it, is exactly excuse making. Because this framing move, when you say that it's not our fault, it's Google and Nokia's fault, it's exactly excuse making. We are not subjects of anything. This is. So, but that narrative, that framing move is not coming from narrative number 2. That framing move is coming from trying to adjust post-colonial rhetoric to what's happening. It's actually absolutely not from number 2, because number 2 is a very elitist narrative. It's not about good Russians, because trust me, no one hated masses of Russians more than Russian liberals. That narrative is about that majority of people in this country are dumb. This narrative is absolutely elitist one. And if I actually take responsibility as a part of this, because that was also my system of belief, that would be the critique in elitism and trying to distance yourself from those masses of people whom you didn't want to consider as your compatriots at all. It's like we are living in a separate country, it's called Moscow, and that's pretty much very strong criticism, which is pretty much true, because narrative number 2 is not about creating excuses like, Russian people are not guilty about it. No, this narrative is exactly, yes, it's a local evil, masses of indoctrinated people. So in this narrative, attribution of guilt would be exactly to the 4th level. But we still have our left colleagues, those who are post-colonial, anti-Zionist, and anti-Putinist at the same time. They're using this framing move, saying it's not Putin, and definitely not Russians. It's all Google and Nokia. So that would be funny, let's put it, funny framing of anti-colonial rhetoric as a source of making excuses.
Any further questions? I see one hand there.
Thank you very much for your engaging presentation. when you were showing us these different narratives and when you were just explaining how it is, well, it appears impossible for you that within the Russian society, if I understood correctly, it's hard to adapt to a new narrative that Russia would be a colonial power, because then Russia would be in a position of like a world leadership or something. You would have the imaginary of a steep pyramid where there is like a ruling power that is coercing the rest of the world, and that seems incomprehensible or something nobody wants to adapt to. But for that reason, you need to find excuses and are looking for technological giants or something, and then the American power or the global leadership comes in again. When I'm looking at this, I'm wondering, like, this seems to be the very trap, in my opinion. The idea or the belief system or the cognitive pattern that many people have, that you have a world that is monopolar with us. Well, you can debate about the geopolitical reality here. Of course, the US is the strongest player right now still, but always resorting to this idea of the steep pyramid of world domination, that is exactly the trap, in my opinion. So my question is, like, how do we exit this very attractive way of thinking? I mean, if you look at the colonial powers throughout history, it's not a necessary prerequisite that colonial powers aspire a world-dominating position, or that they are in such a position. If you look at France, for instance, or the Algerian decolonial fight, for which a lot of decolonial literature, the most known one with Front Fanon, Stanton was taken up in Europe. France was, after the Second World War, in no position to be a world dominating power. Or from a South Korean perspective, of course, the Japanese were the colonizing force, but they were in no position to dominate the world. So this idea of like having some kind of pyramid where the elites are pulling the strings. I mean, there is some inherent anti-Semitism in this already, and I think, so my question is, like, how do we exit these frameworks, right? Like, yeah.
Thank you. For us, it's easier as scholars because we share our own systems of beliefs called theories, and with their own axioms, and it's easy to be in ivory tower and study worldview of other groups. And that's why when you're saying how we can exit to the library, we always can exit as soon as library is open, no problem with that. But when we are saying, like, what actually this monopolar world, how can people exit from these ideas? And when we're talking not from our perspective, because we always have an escape in social theory. But what about people who really believe in this? But it's interesting that this narrative of imperial domination was shaped in 1916 by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in his work Imperialism as a Stage of blah, blah, blah. And at that time, there was no such thing as 1916, as a unified imperialism, neoliberalism, and so on. So for him, those four elements were actually in progress, work in progress. So by that time, he is describing each empire as its separate world dominator, and that ambition leads to World War I. So to some extent, you don't need to have that axiom of monopolar world to believe in this for schemes. It can be very diverse. Actually, this idea of unified center of imperialism came much later. We can find it in Antonio Negri and Hardbook Empire. We can find it actually after World War II. But originally, this very conservative idea of categon, something that prevents, even if one empire prevents another empire from world domination, we can find in 100 years ago, thanks to Lenin. So monopolar world is not the problem here. It's even if tomorrow world will stop being monopolar, that system of belief will survive that moment. Mm-hmm. That narrative, yes. That narrative, yes. This narrative, yes. With the only very important exception that for Lenin, it's not American imperialism. It's European imperialism, and it's not unified. It's diverse. They fight each other, but they still fight to build only one empire. It's like only one should live. So it's pre-monopolar world theory, and it still exists.
I want to ask how much, in your opinion, general Russian public is susceptible to the governmental anti-Semitic narrative, because, well, it feels like now we live in the world where there is basically these two narratives, and both are anti-Israel. Because from our government, we have that certain things are said, and from certain liberal circles, we also have this post-colonial anti-Israel view that goes in package with all the other liberal views. And while from these certain liberal circles, I kind of, like, in my personal impression, I have a sense of this passionate hatred for Israel elections and maybe Israel overall. I was wondering how much just like general population in Russia, in your opinion, even care about this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I tried not to mention, because then we will go much deeper into discussion about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right? Because I strongly believe they are not the same, but the difference is only what I tried to explain through this cartoon. Right? Anti-Zionism is degrading. We are not the global evil, we are local evil now. That's the only difference. If you believe that Jews control the world, it's anti-Semitism. If you believe that Americans control Israelis and Israelis are killing everyone, it's anti-Zionism. So, but what you're saying, it's interesting, because just recently I observed discussion between two experts, former colleagues of mine, who are one pro-Putin, another against Putin, but they both use anti-colonial rhetoric, and it's kind of fight of two anti-colonialists, and the only thing they share actually is anti-Semitism. That's the common denominator. They can overcome their disagreements as soon as they say, but we all agree that Israel is a colonial settler state. So that's very important mission of Israel in nowadays rhetoric. It's to be a common denominator between people who support Putin's invasion and aggressive war against Ukraine, and people who are strongly against it, but also believe in a post-colonial narrative. To what extent general public really believe it? In 2022, when we last time did Eurobarometer, because we produced that theoretical opposition in 2014. We started in 2012. 2014, we see how actually groups were separated according to those two narratives, and then we just seen how the first narrative was gaining more and more and more power, also emotional power, not only in propaganda, but in humans' interviews, in their answers to our questionnaires. And the interesting thing that I don't believe actually that they replaced fifth column with the Jews, because that was actually the easiest framing move to do. All those fifth column, intelligentsia so-called, national traitors, are Jews. And that would be the easiest way to do for Putin's propaganda when he wants to reinforce anti-Zionism as a part of his official narrative. I don't think it happened. Still, I don't have a good quantitative data to say it like the full patience. But that framing move was possible. I'm still not sure that it worked.
I can't help but I have to produce this piece of information, which was published today, on the 11th of December. Today, 9 individuals who participated in an attempt of pogrom in Makhachkala. Mm-hmm. Those of you who follow Russia know that was an attempt of anti-Semitic action in the Makhachkala airport, where supposedly flights from Israel were coming with Israeli refugees. So today, in Putin's Russia, they were sentenced to 9 years of prison based on hate crimes against citizens of Israel. That's quote. decision quoted.
Yeah. So it's not yet, we are not yet there. We are not yet. I would stress that yet. Yep.
First of all, thank you for your presentation and for your lecture. I have two questions. First of all, do you believe it's necessary to follow one of the narratives to form a collective political identity? And second of all, after the death of Putin, what do you think will kind of replace the narrative among Russian citizens, among the Russian elites? Do you think that a new Russian government will kind of join the narrative number 2, but we are the part of the democratic world and kind of close China and other autocratic states, or will there be another replacement for new confrontation with the West?
Yeah, thank you. It's hard to answer the second question because we have no idea what will going to happen. We can just fantasize about. And then there will be a new leader who will join the community of democratic states, and then what happened to Serbian prime minister will happen to him. He was killed. Just a brief hint. And first question is interesting because, for example, that what I mentioned, the fight between good Russians and the best ones, is also two narratives shaping political identities. And that's important because, like, how it's important to follow the narrative. You don't know that you are following the narrative until the moment when you feel very strong emotions. That's the problem with the narrative. When sacred is touched, you can live all your life and never ask yourself, what is sacred to you? What do you consider as absolute pure evil? What do you consider as absolute good? It's some questions that normal people usually do not ask themselves when they wake up, right? But then something happens. And a lot of my informants, they say, we couldn't walk on the street because we had feeling that the streets are poisoned, that it's poisoned land. We just couldn't stay there. We couldn't go to office. It's almost physical feeling. That's why they immigrated. And that's exactly what Durkheim would say. Okay, the line was crossed. Now you know that was profanation of your collective beliefs. And how you can recognize who share the same collective beliefs with you? People who have the same strong emotions about it. That's why during the last 3 years in Russian Facebook, we observe the imminent witch hunt. He's traitor, he's traitor, he's traitor. And why those rituals and the ritual violence is going on? Because it's, again, reproducing political identity. It's about redrawing the lines between sacred and profane, between sacred evil and sacred good, by sacrificing your yesterday's friends, colleagues, and so on. So it's not actually some kind of, we can make in Max Weber style, discuss, rationalize, and say, okay, this is our set of values. No, it's something much deeper and very, very emotional thing. Yep. I see you, yeah. Alexei was my student in Moscow, then in Israel, then he's yeah, not mine.
Yeah, I understand that's not a lecture about sociology or something, but could you maybe elaborate on your position? Why narratives change, why identities shaped by this narrative change? Because for now it seems like we have this common sense explanation that there is just external experience and bumps.
Thank you, first of all, for common sense explanation. I will remember that for the future. It's here I'm totally on the side of Jeff Alexander. Absolutely. There is no such thing as a relations stimul-response between events of external world and reaction of narrative. No, it's a series of framing moves, of framing and reframing. 24th of February was a day when a lot of people lost their language. They didn't know what to say. They couldn't describe. They didn't have optics to understand how it could be possible at all. So they started to use a lot of framing moves, as Dvor Yano and Merlin van Hulst call it, to restore the narrative they believe or to reshape it. Those who tried to restore it, like Yabloko political party, lost contact with people who reshaped it. and who left Russia. And now they used to be the same political community, sharing the same number two narrative, but they did absolutely different moves in different directions. And that's why that idea that let's blame Google and Nokia was also framing move, but unsuccessful. And actually, it's not about external events that change narrative automatically. No, it never happens like this. It's all about reactions to reactions to reactions. Polarization of narrative 1 and narrative 2 was not also automatically a reaction to Putin's politics or to economic processes. No, it was also a reaction to each other. They were trying to distance themselves from each other, and at the end, they completely symmetrized. They became mirrors of each other. So I'm completely here on the side of Alexander with his axiom of cultural sociology that no social structure, no economic process, no political events themselves do not determine the change in narrative. Any more questions? Or we can go to smoke.
Yeah, then thank you very much.
Thank you very much.